What's up guys, and welcome to Bondi Inku's Quick Start Guide to Airbrushing, also known as Airbrushing for Noobs. Super excited to have you guys here, since we are covering one of my favorite topics, the airbrush. And the goal of this video is to get those of you who are newer to airbrushing up and running on your airbrushing journey as quickly as possible. To do this, we'll be covering what items are needed for an airbrushing setup, easy ways to become familiar with your airbrush and get comfortable using it, how to thin your paints for airbrushing, airbrushing technique and Bondi Inku quick tips, how to quickly change colors in your airbrush, how to clean and maintain your airbrush at the end of a painting session so it'll last you for years to come. And finally, address some common problems and questions that you'll likely run into as you start your airbrushing journey. For each of these items, you'll find a timestamp link in the description below. To start things off, let's take a look at all the items that are needed for an airbrushing setup. The main items you're going to need is obviously an airbrush, preferably with a quick connect, which will make connecting and disconnecting your air hose significantly easier. A compressor with a regulator so you can adjust the air pressure that's going to your airbrush, and a good length hose, again, preferably with a quick connect. Some sort of paint that contains fine pigments, which doesn't have to be specifically made for airbrushing. You can make practically any paint work through an airbrush if you thin it right. Which brings us to our next item, some sort of thinning medium and water, preferably in droppers for easy adding to the airbrush. An old paintbrush or something to mix your paint with, a soft bristle toothbrush, and or Q-tips for cleaning the needle tip and removing dry paint, and a painting mask to help keep that paint and chemicals that you'll be spraying out of your airways. Then for cleaning items, you'll need some sort of airbrush cleaner, a spray bottle filled with water, an old jar or cup for gunky paint water, a cleaning cup to spray your dirty water and cleaner into, paper towels or cloth for wiping things down, and a cleaning kit with soft bristle brushes. Other useful things that aren't necessarily required, but I find very useful, are some sort of glove, a painting station or some sort of box to help protect your painting area, particularly in the beginning when you're developing trigger control, some sort of painting grip or holder for your mini, and finally, some potion jars for storing your leftover paint. Once you get all your items for your airbrushing setup, or even if you're in the process of getting all your items, and at least have your airbrush, my recommendation is to start by disassembling and reassembling your airbrush to help familiarize yourself with this new wonderful tool and help you gain a bit of confidence in handling it. It'll also allow you to see all the different parts of the airbrush before you have to clean it for the first time, and will allow you to make sure that everything looks good before you start painting. While each airbrush is a little bit different, each airbrush is essentially composed of the same basic components. For example, here are all three of my airbrushes. We got a Masters airbrush, a Badger Renegade Chrome, and my most recent addition, the Cult of Painting Infinity. Let's take them apart together and go over the various components, starting with the Infinity. The first thing we'll remove is the end piece, which commonly has an internal adjuster that helps limit the movement of the trigger and the needle, which is particularly helpful in the beginning when you're learning just how far back you should or shouldn't pull back the trigger, or when you're trying to paint very fine lines. On most of my airbrushes, I tend to leave this end piece off, like you can see here on my Renegade Chrome. That's because most of the time I find that end piece to be more of an annoyance than a benefit, because it's always locked in the same position. So if you want to have your full range of motion back again, you have to either loosen the adjuster, consequently losing your adjustment setting, or remove the end piece anyway. However, on the Infinity, the end piece is actually quite useful since the adjuster is able to be clicked in when you want to limit your range of motion, and easily clicks back out when you want to have full range of motion again. And with this, it keeps your adjustment settings, so when you click it in again at any point in time, you're back to the same settings that you were before. Because of this, this is the only airbrush that I own that I'll actually keep the end piece on. Next, we remove the nut on the needle chuck, which will allow us to pull the needle out and set it flat on the table, being careful not to poke the tip against anything, which can cause some damage and jack it up, which you definitely do not want to do. After removing the needle, we can unscrew the middle component, which holds the needle spring, and the needle chuck, which are the parts that align the needle through the trigger and body correctly, and help the trigger return to the closed position when released. You can see here how the needle chuck sets inside of the body so that it aligns correctly and stays in place. Then with the needle chuck and the spring removed, we can pull the trigger out, and we want to pay particular attention to how it should align when putting it back in. On this model, the trigger is all one piece, which is very nice and convenient, but you'll see later when we're looking at the Chrome that it actually has two pieces, which you then have to pay a little closer attention to the orientation and the order in which you put those back in. Next, we remove the quick adapter, simply to show what it looks like inside, since apart from this time, there really shouldn't be any reason to remove this unless you're getting some air leaks and want to put some thread tape on it to help it seal better. Next, we're going to remove the paint cup, which on this model is interchangeable. However, on most airbrushes, like my Renegade Chrome here, the paint cup isn't removable, so this step can just be skipped, obviously. Next is the needle cap, which helps protect the tip of the needle from banging against things during usage, as well as the airhead, which holds the needle in place and directs the airflow over the needle, pulling the paint through. Then with the cap and airhead removed, we can then finish the disassembly by pulling the nozzle out, which on this model is fairly good sized and has a little O-ring on the end, which helps create a nice seal against the inside of the body. Now, something important to note about the nozzle is that each nozzle is made to work with one specific needle. So you can't just take any nozzle and find a needle with the same diameter and they'll work together nicely. It just doesn't work that way. You need to be sure to have a needle and nozzle which are made to be compatible. So now that we've disassembled the Infinity, let's quickly disassemble the other two, pointing out some key differences along the way. Now that we've taken them all apart, let's do all that in reverse and put them all back together again. Keeping in mind the following, which is very important to remember. 1. When putting the needle back in, be very careful not to nick the tip, particularly when entering the needle into the needle chuck and when going through the trigger area. 2nd, you'll notice that when pulling the needle out, but particularly when putting it back in, somewhere right behind the paint cup, there's going to be a little bit more friction on the needle than anywhere else. This is where there's a little gasket that seals around the needle, which prevents paint from getting back into the rest of the body. So don't worry, that's normal. And thirdly, when setting the needle into the nozzle, not a lot of force is needed. All you need to do is press the needle in just enough that it sets and stops moving forward, then tighten that back nut, and you're good to go. Now that our airbrush is all put back together, it's time to start playing around. So plug in your airbrush and turn on that compressor. After your compressors run for a little bit, you'll want to be sure to check your regulator to see what air pressure you're letting through. Most likely, if you've got a new compressor, you're probably pushing around 60 plus PSI, which you'll want to dial down to more like 20. And when dialing down your pressure, be sure to be pressing down the trigger on your airbrush so you can see exactly what air pressure is actually going through. Then real quick, before we start spraying anything, let's go over how the airbrush functions. Depending on your airbrush, you're either going to have a single action or a dual action airbrush. A single action airbrush allows you to press down on the trigger and it releases air and paint simultaneously, while on a dual action, you press the trigger down for air and pull the trigger back for paint. Most likely you have a dual action airbrush since that seems to be the more popular option for miniature painting. Alright, so now that you know the basics of how your airbrush works, let's put a little water in the cup and do some practice sprays to get used to how things feel. Practice painting some fine lines, broad lines, dots, swirls, sign your name if you want to. Just get used to how the airbrush feels, how it sprays when you're a certain distance away, how fast you move, how far back you pull back the trigger, etc. And while you're doing that, here's a few quick tips for how to spray different ways. To spray fine lines, you'll want to spray at about an inch away. You want the air on, start your movement, draw back the lever just a little bit during movement only, then smoothly bring the lever back to the front, then let off your air. For broader lines, you're going to do that same thing, except you'll either pull the trigger back farther or have the airbrush a little bit farther away from your painting area, or a combination of both to get the broader spray. For dots, it's easiest to stabilize your airbrush using both hands, though that's optional. Then, while aiming where you want to create the dot, pull the lever back and forth smoothly to create little dots, varying the trigger distance and the distance from your painting surface to create different sizes of dots. Alright, so now that you've got familiar with your airbrush and played around with it a bit, you're ready to learn how to thin your paints so that you can start spraying for reals. So, just like when you're painting with a paintbrush, if you want to get good results, you need to thin your paints correctly. And I know you're all wondering, how do I know when my paint is thinned right? Well, hold on your butts, people, because here comes the answer. You ready? It depends. If you watched any other airbrushing videos, you've probably heard people mention that you want your paint to basically be the consistency of milk. Which, for people who are new to airbrushing, that's kind of confusing. So as you're drip testing your paints, think of it this way. If you were to have some milk that was the same color as your paint, how would it flow when you did a drip test? If it flows about the same and leaves a little trail of paint similar to how milk would, you're probably good. If not, you probably need to do some adjusting by either adding some more paint or adding some more water or thinners. Let's thin some of this turquoise paint together and do some drip tests to further show what I mean. To do this, I'm first going to put 5 or 6 drops of paint into this little cup, then I'll brush a little bit onto a test tile to show the starting consistency of my paint. As you can see, it's got a pretty typical acrylic consistency and is particularly thick and streaky. So now that we have that baseline set, let's start doing some thinning. So to start off, I'm going to add a couple drops of Vallejo Flow Improver, which I like to add about 2 or 3 drops per 6 to 10 drops of paint, then a couple drops of water and mix it up real well. In my experience, paint thin with just water does not work the greatest. The best thing to do is to add some sort of thinning medium, which will help keep the paint's natural properties and dry a little bit slower, decreasing the amount of dry tip you experience, which we'll get to a little later. There are a number of options for thinners you can use, from homemade remedies to store-bought mediums, like Vallejo's Airbrush Thinner and Flow Improver. My advice is to start off by picking one option and play around with that for a while until you get the hang of the airbrush. I like to use Vallejo Flow Improver, so that's what you'll see me use in this video. Alright, so let's do a little brush test again, as well as put a drop up top and do a little drip test. As you can see, it's definitely more smooth to brush on, but it's still thick enough that our paint slowly creeps down the tile, which indicates that the paint is not fluid enough yet. So, let's add another 2 drops of water, and then test again. The drop this time flows slightly quicker, but we're still not seeing all that much difference. So, let's add another drop of water and try again. Now when we do the drip test, the paint flows nicely, not too fast, but not too slow either. This is the thickest you'll probably ever want to have your paint for airbrushing, and is a good starting point for base coats, though most of the time I'd probably add one more drop of water to make it just a little bit thinner. So now that we've got our thickest option, let's keep thinning and show how thin we could really go. So let's grab a dab or 2 from this cup and add some more water to it. Now when we do the drip test, we can see that the paint is now super fluid and runs down the tile very quickly. We can also see in the brush test that it's fairly thin and transparent. This consistency is probably the thinnest you ever want to go, and can be good for some applications like when you want to subtly tint or shade something, particularly when you're spraying inks. However, when you've got your paint this thin, you'll probably want to add a little bit more thinning medium to keep your paint behaving properly, and you'll want to be extra careful with how much pressure you're using and how much trigger you're using to avoid spraying too much paint at once and creating a spider webbing effect. So now that you've seen the thickest you want to go and the thinnest, let's go back and add another drop or 2 to that first mix and show the happy medium, since this is what you're going to want to aim for 90+% of the time. With our paint now thinned, we're ready to dump that paint into our airbrush cup and start doing some spraying. I always like to start off by doing some spray tests on a card or the back of my hand to make sure that the paint's flowing smoothly before I start spraying onto a model. Here you can see that the paint flow isn't quite as smooth as I like, so I added a little extra drop of water and tested again, after which it looked good. I then gave the tip a quick clean by pressing down the trigger to get some airflow, then using a toothbrush to brush off any dry paint off the tip and make sure it's nice and clean before I start painting. Alright, it's finally time. We're ready to paint. We grab our model, which today is Malcor from Arcadia Quest Riders. We hold the airbrush roughly an inch or so away, then start with air only, draw the trigger back slowly till we get a nice flow of paint, then keep the airbrush moving back and forth across the model, applying multiple thin layers, just like we would when painting with a paintbrush, and avoiding applying too heavy of a coat at once. After a little bit, you'll probably start seeing that the paint starts flowing a little bit less, which indicates you're starting to experience the dreaded dry tip. A quick way to sometimes resolve this is to give the airbrush a quick burst onto a card or the back of your hand to blow out some of that dried paint and free up the nozzle. After that, the paint will continue to flow like normal for a time. However, after doing this a time or two, you'll need to come in with a toothbrush or a damp Q-tip and do a more thorough cleaning. After which, you'll again want to give it a quick test spray to make sure everything's spraying good before returning to your model. So now we've got our base coat done, and it's time for a color change, or in this case, a color transition. Now depending on how much paint is left in the cup, I like to dump the majority of the remaining paint into a little potion jar, like you've seen in many of my videos, and then leave a little bit of paint remaining in the cup, which I'll then use to blend with the next color to create a nice transition. For these first level of highlights, I want to step up the brightness of paint just a step or two so it's bright enough to create some brighter areas, but not so bright that the contrast is going to be super extreme. To do this, I keep a drop or two of the previous color in the paint cup, add a couple drops of flow improver, followed by a couple drops of the highlight color, in this case electric blue, and then a drop or two of water and mix it all up with my mixing brush. After which, I do a little drip test on the side of the cup, and once again compare it to milk. If it flows about the same, it's probably good. If it doesn't, probably needs a little bit of adjusting. To help you guys see exactly what the consistency is, let's grab our test tile again and slap some of this paint on it. As you can see, it's roughly the same thickness as our original base coat and kind of looks like blue milk. Then, this is very important, before we start spraying again, we need to clear out the previous color from the nozzle and get the new color flowing through. Then once everything's good to go, it's time to start continue painting. Once again remembering to apply thin layers for a nice smooth paint job. Now while spraying, you're probably going to have a time or two that you spray a bit too much paint onto your model. If you've been applying thin layers of paint like I've mentioned, this will be fairly easy to clean up. All you gotta do is grab a damp paintbrush, mop up the paint, and you can continue on your way. If you haven't and you've been spraying thicker layers, you may accidentally rub up some of your previous layers of paint and you're gonna have a little bit more of an issue. So keep those layers thin and you'll be just fine. After getting done with those first highlights, it was time to pump up the highlights a little bit more by adding some white. So first, once again dumped out the excess paint into a little potion jar, then added some extra flow improver, white paint, and some water, and mix it up real well. Then after testing it, found that it was still a little bit too thin, so I added some extra white paint and some extra flow improver, since due to white's more chalky pigment, it tends to speckle more easily. So by adding some additional flow improver, it helps counteract that chalkiness and keeps the paint smooth with minimal speckling. It'll also help a little bit more with dry tip, since white tends to create dry tip a lot more quickly compared to other colors. Now that we've finished up with the highlights, it's time for a color change. Like usual, this starts with emptying the excess paint from the cup into a little potion jar or onto my wet palette, then pulling out my junk container and my water bottle and using those to get the remaining paint out of the cup, using my mixing brush at times to help get off the paint that's dried to the sides of the cup. Then after the cup is clean, I spray the excess water into my cleaning jar at a higher pressure, usually about 30 psi, to flush the rest of that paint and dirty water out. Again, sometimes using my mixing brush to agitate the water and get the remaining paint in the bottom of the cup to loosen up so I can spray it through. I'll then flush a bit of airbrush cleaner through it, then remove the needle and give it a quick wipe down. And then for the final step, add a little bit of water to the cup, then reinsert the needle and move it back and forth a little bit to loosen any paint that's stuck on that internal O-ring, then tighten down the nut on the needle chuck and give it a final flush through with some clean water. Alright, so now that our airbrush is clean and ready for the next color, let's prepare our model by masking off those previously painted areas so that we don't have to worry about overspray. There are various ways to do this. One of my favorites is using some sort of saran wrap or polystyrene something or other. It's nice because it's cheap, it's easy, and it's fast. With the model now prepped, we're ready to thin our next color by once again putting in a couple drops of flow improver, roughly 8 to 10 drops of paint, and 2 to 3 drops of water. Then, after making any adjustments to the paint, we're ready to apply the second color, making sure to keep that masking material in place so we don't spray any areas that we don't want to paint over. Another nice option for masking is blue tack or silly putty because you can form it to whatever shape you need and you can get it into tighter areas and make sure it stays there easier than you can with saran wrap or other masking options. It's also nice because it's reusable and all you have to do is stretch it out a little bit after each use and it cleans itself off. Another masking option, particularly for those that are feeling a little more lazy, is simply using your finger. You just put it in place over top whatever you want to protect, spray away, then pull your finger away. Then one final masking option that I tend to use a lot is using a card or a piece of paper to mask off larger areas rather easily, so I can just paint a very specific part of the mini, like the end piece of Malcor's cape. Now let's say we're at the end of our painting session, and it's time to clean up our airbrush and put it away for the night. We're going to follow the same steps that we did with the quick color change, except we're going to be a bit more thorough in cleaning the needle, the tip, and the body. So once again, we'll rinse it out using our junk pot and our water bottle, then spray some water and some airbrush cleaner through it, wiggle our needle back and forth to loosen up some paint from the O-ring, and then pull the needle out to give it a wipe down. However, this time when we wipe down the needle, we're going to give it a couple passes and spray some airbrush cleaner on the paper towel to give it a more thorough cleaning. We'll then remove the needle cap, the airhead, and the nozzle, and give the front part of the airbrush, where the nozzle sits against the body, a wipe down with a Q-tip, being sure not to leave any threads of the Q-tip inside the airbrush, followed by a little bit of scrubbing with a soft bristle brush. Emphasis on the soft bristles, especially if you have a model like the Badger Renegade Chrome or the Masters Airbrush, where it has a very small opening where the nozzle sits into the body. because if you scratch that up using a harder bristle, the nozzle is not going to sit flushly inside of the body and you're going to get some air leaks. And that sucks to replace. Believe me, I just had to replace my Renegade Chrome body because I scratched it up with a crappy brush. Next, I clean off the needle cap and the airhead, making sure to remove any dried paint, and then set them aside to dry. Next, I clean out the nozzle, first with some tiny brushes to loosen up any paint that's still left inside, then with the needle to make sure the nozzle is nice and clean. I then finish cleaning the inside of the body and the paint cup, sometimes including the needle chuck and the back end of the airbrush, depending on how messy the painting session went or how long it's been since I last cleaned it. I then reassemble the airbrush, give it a final flush through with some water, and then give it a wipe down with my polishing cloth. Alright, now that we've covered setting up your airbrush, how to become familiar with your airbrush, thinning your paints, airbrushing technique, quick color changes, and cleaning your airbrush, it's time to address some common problems and questions that everyone eventually encounters when they start airbrushing. Number 1. Bubbles are forming in the paint cup, which is commonly accompanied by irregular spray patterns. Usually what this means is your nozzle isn't snug against the body, which is letting air get in, creating the bubbles in your paint cup. Usually the only thing you have to do to solve this is tighten that air cap on the front of the airbrush. Number 2. Spider webbing, which is pretty much exactly like it sounds. You end up with a spiderweb looking splat on your model. This usually occurs when you're spraying either very thin paint or spraying with too high a pressure or a combination of both. So to fix this, you either want to drop your air pressure, thicken your paint, and or spray the airbrush from farther away and dial back your trigger finger a little bit. Number 3. Speckling. Speckling can be caused by a number of things, but the main culprits are dry tip, too thick of paint, too low of air pressure, or not enough thinning medium. So to solve this, thin your paint a little bit more, play around with upping your air pressure, and add a little bit of thinning medium to help with the drying time and the smoothness of your paint. Number 4. Having troubles keeping your lines consistent or struggling with brush stability. In the beginning, the main culprit of this is just not being familiar with the airbrush. Using the adjuster on the end piece can help you have one less thing to worry about and will help you keep your lines consistent. Also, set your model on the table and use your non-dominant hand to stabilize the airbrush. Putting your arms or elbows up on or against the table can also help with stability. And loosen your grip. You do not need to death grip your airbrush. A nice, comfortable grip is all you need. And finally, practice. Practice your fine lines, your broad lines, your loops, your dots. Practice, practice, practice. Number 5. What pressure should I use to spray my paints? Well, can't really tell you specifically because each airbrush is a little different. Some perform better with the airbrush a little higher, while some perform lower, and it also depends on how you thin your paint. However, the following air pressures, give or take 2 or 3 psi, should be a good starting point for practically any airbrush. Between 18 and 25 psi is usually good for base coating, priming, and cleaning. 12 to 16 is good for highlights, shadows, blends, and mid-range details, and 5 to 12 psi is good for fine details or fine lines. And keep in mind, with the lower the pressure, the thinner you're going to have your paint, and the more careful you're going to need to be with your trigger finger to not have spider webbing. And finally, number 6. Why does spraying white suck so bad? Well, it's white. And white hates everyone. So, if you can, avoid using white until you get more comfortable with your airbrush, then take it on. You can do it. Just add a little bit more flow improver or some sort of drying retarder, and white will be a lot more friendly to you. And there you have it, guys. There is Bondi Inku's quick start guide to airbrushing. I hope this was a helpful video and answered many of the questions that you guys have coming into airbrushing. If you have any additional questions or would enjoy an additional video covering specific topics about airbrushing, whether that be specific skills or troubleshooting or whatever, let me know in the comments below. We can add that to the list. As always, thank you guys for joining. I appreciate all of you guys being here, checking out the videos, and we'll see you guys on the next one. Airbrushing for Noobs, complete! Bondi.